It's the early hours of April 9th, 1940. In Oslo, the Norwegian cabinet is woken for an emergency meeting. German warships have been sighted approaching the major ports of Bergen, Trondheim and Narvik. At 4:30 am, the German ambassador, Kurt Brauer, arrives to demand that the Norwegians submit to Nazi occupation, under the pretense of protecting Norway from British action against it. Taking just a few minutes to consider the offer, the Norwegians are unanimous in rejecting it. As this is happening, the German heavy cruiser Blücher leads a powerful naval squadron into the Oslo fjord and towards the Norwegian capital. Should she reach the city on schedule, then the Norwegian cabinet and royal family will be overrun before they can evacuate, making their rejection of terms redundant. Norway would fall virtually without a fight, just like its southern neighbour Denmark. As Blücher reaches the Drøbak Narrows, however, she is illuminated by a searchlight from the Oscarsborg naval fortress. Without hesitation, the fortress's commander, Colonel Eriksson, identifies Blücher as hostile and orders the enormous 15-inch guns under his command to open fire. Hit multiple times in a matter of minutes, Blücher is soon ablaze from stem to stern. 10 minutes later, Oscarsborg's torpedo batteries fire, hitting the heavy cruiser and sealing her fate. Hundreds of German sailors perish in the sinking, and the advance on Oslo is turned back, for now. It's first blood to Norway in a campaign that will last for the next 2 months. The battle for Norway has begun. Having been bought precious time by the resolve of Oscarsborg, the Norwegian government left the capital at 7:20 am, arriving at Hamar in the afternoon to convene parliament. Remarkably, as thousands of hostile troops occupied her major cities, the Norwegian government hesitated, hoping for a diplomatic solution. A mobilisation of Norway's army was ordered, but by post rather than radio, with a mobilisation date set for April 12th, 3 full days after the invasion. It was a ponderous reaction to being attacked, by both the defence minister and the commander-in-chief of the army, General Lorca. As the Norwegians dithered, Captain Everhard Spiller, the air attaché at the German embassy in Oslo, decided to take matters into his own hands. Rather than waiting for the Norwegians to surrender voluntarily, he decided to launch a lightning raid to capture the Norwegian king and force him to give his country up. Gathering a company of elite Fallschirmjäger, he left Oslo not long before sunset and headed north. As Spiller approached Hamar, word spread of the arrival of German troops, and the Norwegian king Håkon VII was hurriedly evacuated eastwards to the town of Elverum. To protect the king, a roadblock was put in place at Midtskogen, using 100 or so raw recruits and civilian volunteers. At 1:30 am, April 10th, the German paratroopers arrived at the roadblock and began a fierce firefight with Norwegians blocking the road east. After 90 minutes of fighting, the Germans were forced to retreat and Captain Spiller was mortally wounded. It was a morale-boosting victory for Norway after a shattering 24 hours, and it secured the king's safety. The following day, Norway rejected Germany's final demands after King Håkon announced he would abdicate if his government decided to capitulate. Norway would fight on. And to underline this point, General Lorca was sacked and replaced by Colonel Otto Ruger, who was promoted to general and tasked with resisting the Germans. Ruger inherited a perilous situation. Of the 6 divisions of the Norwegian army, only 2 had managed to mobilise and deploy properly. The 6th Division at Narvik and the 2nd Division in central Norway. Elsewhere, Norwegian troops found themselves overrun by German forces before they could even properly organise themselves. With a huge disparity in strength developing, Ruger quickly decided that Norway's only chance of survival rested on support from the Allies. Placing what little troops he had north of Oslo, the new Norwegian commander-in-chief hoped to slow the German advance towards Trondheim. If the enemy could be delayed long enough, then perhaps the Allies would be able to arrive and come to Norway's aid. The German commander in Norway, Nicolas von Falkenhorst, was well aware that as each day passed, the likelihood of British and French reinforcement increased, so he wanted a breakout from Oslo as quickly as possible. Pushing to Trondheim was to be the main focus of the advance, and for this the Germans had troops from multiple divisions available within a few days, but with nothing like full division strength or organisation. To compensate for this, the Germans in Norway would rely heavily on ad hoc Kampfgruppe, which incorporated infantry, tanks and artillery into small all-arms battle groups capable of operating independently. For the beginning of the drive north, the Germans fielded 4 Kampfgruppe, each led by a colonel and named for their commander: Adlock, Zantier, Landel and Fischer. These units would form the spearhead of the advance towards Trondheim through the great valleys of the Gudbrandsdal and the Østerdal. The German attack began on April 13th and made good progress after stubborn initial resistance. The Norwegians had no proper anti-tank weapons and no hope of challenging the Luftwaffe's air superiority, so holding their opponents back for any length of time was difficult. By April 16th, Group Fischer had taken Kongsvinger and pushed to the southern end of the Østerdal Valley, while Group Landel broke through Norwegian lines to capture Hamar on April 18th. 2 days later, these groups linked up at Elverum, severing the last railway connection to Sweden from southern Norway. Further west, Group Adlock captured Fluburg on April 19th, and Group Zantier secured Gjøvik the following day. The Germans now moved to launch a pincer movement on Lillehammer, which sat at the southern end of the Gudbrandsdal Valley. As they did so, the first British troops were arriving in the area, in the shape of 3 battalions of the 148th Brigade under Brigadier Harold Morgan. Morgan's troops were part-time militiamen, sent to Norway in probably one of the worst organised expeditions in the history of the British Army and Navy. Ordered on April 13th to board a ship for Namsos north of Trondheim, at the very last minute they were ordered to disembark, board 5 smaller ships and sail instead for Åndalsnes, to the south of Trondheim. When Morgan's troops arrived, they found that some things had been left behind, including their communications equipment, mortar ammunition, vehicles, anti-aircraft equipment, and half a battalion that couldn't fit on the ships. To make matters worse, they had no artillery, no air support, and all of their maps were for their original destination at Namsos. It was a shambles. Further north, the 146th Brigade arrived at Namsos in a similar state of chaos, having originally been destined for Narvik. Under the command of Major General Carton de Wyatt, the British advanced to Steinkjer and began to build up troops with the intention of advancing on Trondheim in conjunction with Brigadier Morgan's troops further south. However, the dangerous advance of the Germans had led to a change of plans. On arrival, Morgan met with General Ruger, who informed him that the Norwegian troops fighting south of Lillehammer urgently needed reinforcement to prevent a total collapse. Morgan agreed to rush his 2.5 battalions south, where they were dispersed amongst the Norwegian units. Unfortunately, possessing no heavier weapons than the Norwegians did, they were unable to have much of an impact and were forced into retreat quickly by a German advance supported by heavy Luftwaffe bombing. Lillehammer fell by April 21st, and German troops entered the Gudbrandsdal. Group Fischer broke through Norwegian lines at the village of Osta in the Østerdal on the same day, cementing its position in the valley. At this point, both sides were forced to reorganise their troops, but for opposite reasons. The Germans were now able to build up a greater density of troops, so returned a measure of divisional control over its spearheads. Responsibility for the drive towards Trondheim was given to General Richard Pellengar, commander of the 196th Infantry Division. For the Norwegians, the situation had worsened considerably, as units became depleted in the heavy fighting. In the east and west, Colonels Hjorth and Dahl were given command of their own ad hoc task forces, charged with doing what they could to delay the German advance in the Østerdal and west of the Gudbrandsdal, respectively. In the north, the situation was no better for the Allies. On April 20th, the German force advancing from Trondheim was able to eject the British and Norwegians from Steinkjer, despite being at a significant numerical disadvantage. The deciding factor, once again, was the total air supremacy that the Germans possess. General de Wyatt sent a message to the British High Command, warning that it would be impossible for him to complete his mission if the Germans retained dominance in the air. In an effort to address this, a squadron of 18 Gladiator fighters from 263 Squadron RAF were flown in to operate from Leerskog on April 24th. Only 2 of these managed to get airborne when a Luftwaffe bombing raid appeared early the next morning. 10 fighters were destroyed on the ground, and Allied efforts to contest the skies over central Norway immediately crippled. In the Gudbrandsdal, this lack of air cover would have terrible results for the British. By April 23rd, what remained of the 148th Brigade had been reunited at Tretten, alongside 300 Norwegian troops from the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. Morgan intended to make a stand at Tretten, which held a key bridge across the Gudbrandsdalslagen to Task Force Dahl's positions. In the afternoon of April 23rd, the Germans attacked with tanks, and the British discovered that their anti-tank rifles were completely useless against them. Tretten held out until the early evening before its defences collapsed and a chaotic withdrawal ensued. In the confusion, hundreds of British troops were captured, reducing the brigade's strength to just 300 by the following day, down from 700. The Allied line in the valley was shattered, and Task Force Dahl's rear area threatened by German troops crossing the bridge at Tretten. Dahl would valiantly counterattack the Germans over the next few days, but would eventually be completely isolated from the rest of the Allied armies and forced to surrender on April 29. In a last-ditch attempt to salvage the situation, the British rushed the 15th Brigade forward, which had landed at Åndalsnes on April 23rd. Led by Brigadier H.E.F. Smith, the 15th Brigade was made up of regular troops secretly transferred from France and came with proper anti-tank weaponry like the Hotchkiss anti-tank gun. Holding a position at Kvam, the brigade met with initial success, repelling repeated German attacks on April 25th and 6th in some of the hardest fought battles of the Norway campaign. Eventually, however, German superiority in artillery and air support told, and the British were forced back, shattering any real hope of holding the Gudbrandsdal against the German advance. In the Østerdal, by the time the 15th Brigade was defeated, Task Force Hjort had been broken from positions at Renna and was being pursued relentlessly north. Combined with the defeats around Steinkjer, it suddenly looked as if the Allied troops could well be encircled around Trondheim, just as they had been in France. Alarmed by this, the British began to draw up plans in secret to evacuate its troops from central Norway. 2 days later, General Bernard Paget, in command of British troops at Åndalsnes, informed General Ruger that an evacuation was going to take place. Ruger, who had been kept in the dark, was furious, but kept his emotions in check. He remarked, "So, Norway is to share the fate of Czechoslovakia and Poland." Despite his understandable anger, he agreed to do what he could to assist the British evacuation. Over the next 48 hours, the British fell back more than 180 kilometres to the coast and were evacuated to safety. On May the 1st, General Ruger and the Norwegian royal family followed, departing for Tromsø in northern Norway. At Namsos, the British did not inform the local Norwegian commander of their evacuation until May 2nd, virtually after it had finished. On May 3rd, the remaining Norwegian troops in central Norway surrendered, leaving the bulk of Norway now in German hands. Only at Narvik were substantial numbers of Allied troops still fighting, and it's there that the story of Norway 1940 will conclude next time.